All right, ready to dive into some fascinating legal situations. We've got estate disputes, personal injury lawsuits, even a potential wrongful conviction case lined up.
Absolutely. It's like we're about to unpack mysteries hidden within the pages of law reports.
Exactly. And speaking of mysteries, our first case takes us back to 2007 with the Iasenza estate case from Ontario. It's a story about a widow, a will, and how choices made under family law can have some really, really unexpected consequences.
Yet you see, this case really highlights what happens when a person's will clashes with the rights of a surviving spouse, especially under legislation like Ontario's Family Law Act. It's a classic example of the delicate balance between personal desires and, legal entitlements.
So it's like two separate sets of rules trying to govern the same situation almost.
Precisely. And in these situations, the surviving spouse has options. They can inherit according to what's written in the will, or they can choose to pursue a claim under the Family Law Act. And the complexity arises when those choices have, well, unforeseen implications.
Okay, so in this case, Mrs. Isenza initially chose the Family Law Act path, but then later wanted to switch back to inheriting based on her late husband's will. What caused that change of heart?
It seems Mrs. Isenza wasn't made fully aware of certain assets, potentially ones that were transferred to the deceased son before his death. So it really brought up this crucial question of whether a legal decision, even one labeled irrevocable, could be reversed if a misunderstanding occurred.
Irrevocable sounds pretty, definitive, like you're locked in. I bet that's where things got really interesting. Did the court really allow her to undo that initial choice?
They did. And this is where the case offers a valuable lesson. While the term irrevocable election might sound intimidating and permanent, it doesn't necessarily mean there's no room for adjustments. The court actually sided with Mrs. Iasenza in this situation, placing significant weight on the need for fairness and transparency in these inheritance matters.
So even though she made a choice that seemed final, the court recognized that she might not have had all the information she needed.
Precisely. The court found that without all the necessary information, she couldn't be considered to have given truly informed consent, especially given the emotional turmoil that often surrounds these types of situations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It really highlights just how important it is to understand the full picture, not just of the law itself, but of your own specific situation before making any significant decisions after a loved one passes away.
Absolutely. Seeking legal counsel is, well, it's incredibly important, especially in situations involving blended families or complex financial histories where things can get murky. This case really throws open the doors on what can happen when emotions and legalities collide.
That case really shows how, even with something like inheritance, things can get complicated. But, legal complexities aren't limited to matters of family and wills. Our next case, Rathwell v. Shorey. It's a 2024 case from British Columbia. This one plunges us into the world of personal injury law and really highlights the lasting impact that even a seemingly minor car accident can have on someone's life.
You're right, it really underscores the point that not all injuries are visible. This case specifically delves into the often misunderstood and misrepresented world of chronic pain.
Yeah, it's true. You can't always see the pain that someone carries with them. So, how does the legal system grapple with something as subjective and, well, invisible as chronic pain?
That's a question at the very heart of this case. You see, even a low-speed collision can have this ripple effect on someone's health and well-being. But proving the true extent of those invisible injuries and directly linking them to the accident itself, that can be incredibly challenging. It often becomes a battle of, medical opinions and legal arguments.
And I imagine that's what happened here.
Absolutely. We see Mrs. Rathwell, the plaintiff in this case. She sought substantial damages for her chronic pain, arguing that it had significantly altered her life, all stemming from this car accident. On the other hand, the defendant, they argued for minimal compensation, claiming that her injuries were minor, they'd resolved quickly, and any lingering pain. Well, they claimed that was unrelated to the accident.
So, you have this huge gap between the plaintiff's experience and what the defendant is willing to acknowledge. So, how do courts begin to navigate that?
That's where things get really, really intricate. It boils down to legal concepts like causation, the burden of proof, and how you even begin to assess damages in a situation like this. To put it simply, Mrs. Rathwell had to prove, through convincing evidence, that the accident directly caused her chronic pain. It wasn't enough to just say, I'm in pain. She had to demonstrate a clear link.
It sounds like an uphill battle, especially when you're dealing with something that doesn't show up on an x-ray. How do you prove something you can't even see?
That's the heart of the challenge. Courts, they often rely on a combination of things: medical records, expert testimony from specialists, and of course, the plaintiff's own account of their pain, their limitations. It's like piecing together a puzzle, looking for that pattern that convincingly connects the accident to the injuries claimed.
And in the case of Ms. Rathwell, did the court find that connection?
They did. But it wasn't a complete victory for either side. The judge ultimately awarded her compensation. They did acknowledge the lasting impact of her injuries, but it wasn't the full amount she'd initially sought.
So even though the defendant admitted liability for the accident itself, determining the appropriate compensation, especially for those less tangible, those invisible injuries, it was still a complex process. Weighing the evidence, looking at the legal principles, it really highlights just how challenging it can be for courts to quantify things like pain and suffering.
Absolutely. And it underscores how, in personal injury cases, the legal battle often extends beyond simply proving who was at fault. It becomes about demonstrating the true extent of the harm suffered.
While Rathwell v. Shorey dealt with the often hidden consequences of physical injury, our next case takes us deep into the world of criminal law, where proving what happened often hinges on evidence that's not always clear-cut. Ready for a true crime twist?
Always up for a legal puzzle. What do we got?
Yeah. This time, we're stepping into a courtroom in Ontario 2024 for the case of R.V. Panofsky. It's a murder trial set against the backdrop of, get this, the intensely competitive world of dog training. And the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher.
Oh, murder trials.
Uh-huh.
They're always fascinating from a legal standpoint. The burden of proof is incredibly high. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, relying on evidence to construct this compelling narrative that points directly to the accused. What makes this particular case so intriguing?
Well, for starters, the victim and the accused, Mr. Panofsky, were both deeply embedded in this niche world of, believe it or not, competitive dog training. It's a world driven by passion, rivalry, and let's face it, sometimes some pretty big personalities.
I see. So the setting itself adds another layer of complexity to the case. Was there a history between Mr. Panofsky and the victim?
There was. They had a past, one that included Mr. Panofsky actually being considered a suspect in a previous similar incident involving the victim. So naturally, this prior encounter became a significant part of the prosecution's case. It cast this shadow of suspicion over Mr. Panofsky.
It makes sense that the prosecution would highlight that prior incident, especially in a case that might rely on circumstantial evidence. It helps build a narrative, right? A narrative of motive, of potential history. But as we know, suspicion alone, it isn't enough for a conviction.
Exactly. And in a dramatic turn of events, the judge ultimately acquitted Mr. Panofsky, highlighting that while suspicion and circumstantial evidence can be suggestive, they don't automatically equate to proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's a crucial distinction. And it goes back to that incredibly high bar for proof in these criminal cases. So if circumstantial evidence wasn't enough, what ultimately swayed the judge's decision? What led to that not guilty verdict?
The judge meticulously scrutinized every piece of evidence presented, from eyewitness accounts to forensic evidence, examining Mr. Panofsky's actions both before and after the shooting. It sounds like the defense really successfully poked holes in that narrative, raising enough doubt to prevent that guilty verdict. It's a good reminder that every piece of evidence, especially in a case like this, it's like a piece of a puzzle. It has to fit perfectly to really get that complete picture.
Precisely. And in this case, it seems some pieces were missing, or just didn't quite align the way the prosecution needed them to. While the circumstances surrounding the victim's death, yeah, they were certainly suspicious, that judge ultimately held firm to that fundamental principle of our justice system, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Speaking of complex cases, our final deep dive takes us into the world of international legal disputes with Bajaj v. Bajaj. It's a 2024 case out of Ontario. This time, we're not just dealing with legal battles within Canada's borders, we're going global.
Ah, yes. This case really showcases how family law matters, often perceived as relatively straightforward, can become incredibly intricate when we start crossing those international borders. We're no longer just dealing with Canadian law, we're navigating this web of legal systems, each with its own nuances.
And in this case, it wasn't just about, a couple parting ways. There were these serious allegations of domestic violence. And the wife was concerned that if the Canadian court granted the divorce, it might somehow impact her case against her husband back in India.
It's a valid concern, and it raises this really important question about how legal systems interact with one another. You see, Canadian courts, they operate within their jurisdiction, right? They can't dictate the outcome of legal proceedings in another country. However, they also strive to avoid making decisions that could unintentionally harm someone's legal standing elsewhere. It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
It sounds like trying to juggle two sets of rules at the same time. How did the court even begin to approach this? With so much at stake, across continents even.
It required a deep, deep understanding of both Canadian and Indian law. And the court really, they relied heavily on expert opinions from specialists in Indian family law, trying to determine how a Canadian divorce order, how that might be interpreted and potentially even used in those Indian legal proceedings.
So it's like needing a legal translator almost, someone who can bridge the gap between two different legal languages.
Exactly. In these types of cases, cases with international implications, expert witnesses, they play this absolutely crucial role to give the court the necessary context, the insight to ensure they're making a decision that respects both Canadian law and, the relevant aspects of that foreign legal system.
Did the Canadian court ultimately grant the divorce despite those concerns?
They did. After careful consideration, weighing the potential risks, the court determined that the evidence didn't support the wife's fears that a Canadian divorce order would negatively affect her legal position in India.
It sounds like a tough decision, trying to balance, the couple's desire for the divorce, but also with that need to protect the wife's rights in her ongoing case in another country. It just highlights how interconnected our world has become, even in matters of family law.
Indeed. This case, Bajaj v. Bajaj, it serves as a reminder that we're living in this increasingly globalized world and those legal complexities. Yeah, they often transcend national borders.
We've covered a lot of legal ground today, from inheritance disputes and those invisible injuries to a murder trial and the complexities of international divorce. Each case really offered a unique glimpse into a different corner of the legal world, showcasing just how judges grapple with these difficult decisions, how they interpret often very complex evidence, and ultimately how they strive to uphold justice.
You've brought us quite the collection of cases this time around, each one a testament to the fact that the law, well, it's so much more than just a set of rules. It's this constantly evolving system that tries to keep pace with the realities of our ever-changing world.
Well said. It's been fascinating to really unpack these cases with you, seeing how these legal battles unfold. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
A key takeaway for me is the importance of seeking expert guidance. When you're navigating any legal matter, whether it's drafting a will, dealing with the aftermath of an accident, or even facing accusations in a criminal case, having that knowledgeable advocate in your corner, well, it can make all the difference. The law can be incredibly intricate, and understanding your rights, your obligations within that system, it's essential for a just outcome.
Couldn't agree more. It's like having a guide in what can feel like a very complex maze. All right, that's a wrap on today's deep dive into the world of legal disputes. We hope you found this exploration insightful and that you're walking away with a better understanding of how the law works in action.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
And remember, if you ever find yourself needing to take a deep dive into a legal conundrum, you know where to find us.